Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first session focusing on trade and climate issues, where we take a particular regional perspective on the interface between trade and climate issues. The region that we're taking a look at is Eastern Southern Africa. And this region is home to a very large number of least developed countries, landlocked countries, and countries that are vulnerable in many, many other respects. These are also countries that are very important as far as their agricultural production is concerned. And increasingly, we see that services such as tourism are playing an important role in the contribution to economic activity of these countries. These are all very important issues when we take a look at the impact of climate change. What we have seen, and we've heard from our introductory speakers this morning, is that climate change does not respect national geopolitical boundaries. This means that we need to tackle the problems of climate change and the trade climate change interface at different levels. National level initiatives are particularly important, and we'll certainly be addressing some of those. But regional perspectives, although very scarce at this stage, could play a very important role. We've heard from our colleagues at the WTO, for example, indicating that there are already some scope for addressing some of the trade climate change challenges that appear. The negotiations that are ongoing this week, following from last week, demonstrate how difficult it is to negotiate a multilateral trade agreement, or in fact, a multilateral climate change agreement. So trade and climate change certainly share challenges as far as the development of the multilateral level of governance is concerned. In our session, we're going to be taking a look at the Eastern Southern African region, and we'll take a look at some big picture issues. Sean Wolfrey, our first speaker, is going to be taking a look at some of the scientific evidence. And this is particularly important because if we are going to develop appropriate interventions at the policy level, then understanding what our scientists are discovering is particularly important. So he will focus on some of the big policy debates in this interface, this connection between trade and climate change. We'll move then to more specific issues. And Paul Kruger, our speaker on the middle, is going to be taking a look at regional energy trade. Viljoen, our last speaker, will be taking a look at trade in environmental products. And one of the issues that she'll be focusing on is non-tariff barriers. Now, the Eastern Southern African region is one that has embraced regional integration as part of its overall development strategy. And some progress has been made in terms of trade liberalization, but many, many challenges, which are very important in the current discussion on trade and climate change, remain. Infrastructure development, domestic regional regulatory harmonization, and in particular, non-tariff barriers. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Sean to make his presentation.
Thanks very much, Trudy. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Trudy said, I'm going to start off our session today just by giving a bit of an overview of what I think are some of the more relevant issues in this climate change and trade nexus, and specifically with relation to Southern Africa as a region. I'm looking here, it says Southern Africa, but a lot of the insights that I will share with you apply as well to countries outside of the immediate SADC region, thinking of countries in COMESA and EAC, and perhaps throughout Africa as a whole. This is despite the fact that, of course, within the continent, the countries differ very much in terms of their physical, economic, and social characteristics. I think it's also useful to give an overview of these issues at this point, and in particular to link them to Southern Africa, because it may very well be true that the climate change and trade nexus is very much a niche aspect of the whole climate change discourse, but I think it's a very, very important one for our region. And this is because, unlike for some of the other regions in the world, it has a very strong developmental aspect, and I hope that comes through in the presentation that I'll give you. Okay, so I'll start, I think, by discussing some of the scientific evidence for climate change and what its likely impacts are going to be on Southern Africa. Now, at this point, it's probably a good point as any to note that, first of all, I'm not a scientist, so I apologize if some of the misunderstandings of mine come through, but I will try my best to make sense of what I've understood. But also to point out that with regards to climate change, a lot of what we're dealing with is based on predictions of climate models, which of course are subject to human error. They're subject to a lot of unforeseen circumstances, and hence we're dealing with predictions that may or may not come true. But still, we can make a number of assumptions about what is likely to happen, and it's important that we take those assumptions seriously and take those predictions seriously. So for instance, if we look at a lot of the climate models and what they predicted for Southern Africa, we see that the region is likely to be amongst the regions most affected by climate change. There seems to be significant consensus in the science that Africa as a whole is warming, the temperatures are rising faster than in the globe as a whole, and that this is likely to continue. So rising temperatures is likely to be a reality in the future. With regard to rainfall, the evidence is a little bit more mixed. Various models give different predictions in terms of whether we're likely to see wetter or drier climates. What does come through, however, is that the region, which at the moment is very known for its variability in rainfall, is going to continue to exhibit very variable rainfall patterns. And it's very likely that certain sub-regions within the region will experience greater rainfall, while others will experience less rainfall. Of course, we're not 100% sure about this, but this seems to be the consensus amongst the climate models. We also see significant consensus that there's going to be an increase in the intensity and the frequency of what they term extreme weather conditions. So things like tropical storms, droughts, for instance. We're going to see more flooding. And of course, later down the line, we will see rising sea levels if a serious mitigating action is not taken. And this, of course, will have an effect on the coastal areas and the island states as well in the region. Unfortunately for the region, climate change is also a bit of a double whammy, because not only is the region likely to be more severely affected than others, it's also considered to be the region least able to adapt to climate change. There are a number of reasons for this vulnerability. The first is that the region is heavily reliant on agriculture. I think agriculture accounts for something around 60% of the region's employment, of African employment, and in some countries it's more than half of GDP. Agriculture, of course, is very sensitive to climate change, and hence this is one source of great vulnerability. Africa, of course, is also considered to have weak adaptive capacity, and that's based on a number of factors. One is widespread poverty. This limits the options for people who have their livelihoods, who have their lives affected directly by climate change, to branch out into other activities, to move regions, to move where they live. Poor infrastructure will, of course, have an effect. We see also the fact that Africa is divided, and Southern Africa as well, is divided into many small countries, and that even within countries, we have different ethnic groups that perhaps do not necessarily mix as much as in other parts of the world. And this can also affect the ability of people to migrate from areas that are more severely affected to areas that are less affected. The sectors and the areas in which Africa is likely to be most affected include health, for example, spread of diseases such as malaria, dengue, cholera, out of their traditional ranges. Ecosystems and biodiversity are likely to be severely affected, with knock-on effects for conservation areas and for nature-based tourism, for example. Forestry will be affected. Increased water scarcity will have an effect on forestry, as will the inability of certain species to survive higher temperatures. Human settlements will be affected. Rapid urbanization will occur, bringing with it a lot of negative consequences. People will have to move from areas which cannot any longer support them and their livelihoods. Coastal zones will be affected ultimately by rising sea levels. Water and food security will also be threatened. So we see already a number of negative impacts that climate change, if it is not curtailed, will have on the region. But it will also have an important effect on trade in the region. And as I mentioned, I think this is an important issue for the region. Why is that? Well, Southern Africa, and Africa as a whole, as I said, is made up of a number of countries. And this means that there are a number of relatively small internal markets. Hence, to develop, to encourage economic development, and to secure the gains in industries that we need to secure economic development, there is this kind of necessity to export. In this, we look to the example of countries in East Asia, for example, who used export as a tool for economic development. Therefore, the ability of the region to produce and to export goods is very, very important in terms of development. There are two channels in which climate change is going to most severely affect the ability of countries in the region to produce and trade goods. The first channel is the direct and indirect effects on productive capacity. I've already mentioned agriculture. So we're likely to see, from rising temperatures and from some areas that experience decreased rainfall, lower crop yields. Certain areas which can only at the moment support marginal agriculture are likely to be pushed out of agriculture altogether. This is going to be most important for small-scale farmers, a lot of whom are reliant on rain-fed agriculture for their livelihood, and who can't also adapt very easily. Impacts on health will also have a direct effect on productive capacity. We already know about the HIV/AIDS pandemic in Southern Africa and how all the expected impacts that is likely to have on productivity. Similar effects may happen if diseases such as malaria and dengue continue to spread throughout the region. The destruction of already weak infrastructure will also have an effect on the ability of the region to produce and to trade goods. Roads, for example, many of which are not in good condition as it is, could in turn be affected more severely by flooding, and hence overland trade will be affected. Impacts on natural resources will also affect the trade of services. I think here, for example, tourism is a good example. If we see destruction of unique ecosystems and natural areas, this will affect our ability to promote eco-based tourism, nature tourism, game parks, these sorts of things. The other channel through which climate change will likely have a negative effect on the ability of our region to trade is, and what has already been mentioned, the phenomenon of green protectionism. So, for example, border carbon adjustments. I think we're having 2 sessions later today which will delve very deeply into this, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but there are a number of issues that relate to border carbon adjustments, and are they likely to be designed so as to be WTO legal? What are the geopolitical implications? How will developing countries react to the imposition by countries such as the US or regions such as the EU? But suffice to say that South Africa, as one particular country in the region, would likely be affected. We see a lot of carbon-intensive industry in South Africa. It's a country where electricity is largely generated by coal. But also there are other industries within the region that could be affected. One thinks, for example, of mineral exports. But it's not only border carbon adjustments that maybe have a dampening effect on Africa's ability to trade with the rest of the world. Standards and labeling regulations may also have a negative effect, especially when one considers that many of the agricultural exporters in the region are small scale and may not have the ability to comply with all of these standards and labeling regulations. Shifting consumption patterns which arise from, for example, standards and carbon labeling initiatives may also negatively affect Africa, as the food miles debate has, for instance, shown. Africa, unfortunately, certainly Southern Africa, is not that well situated in terms of our trading partners, so food miles may become another issue. So what can be done? Well, one point I'd like to make, and I think it's quite important, is that we're living in a time where multilateral action is probably not as easy as it has been in past eras. This is not something that's unique to the climate change discourse. We've seen it in Doha, we've seen it in other arenas. We're moving towards a multipolar system. We've recently had a severe global financial crisis. We've seen a breakdown in US politics, or maybe that's a bit too extreme, but certainly US politics has been slightly dysfunctional of late. We're likely to see a shift in leadership in China soon. All these reasons make multilateral action quite difficult at the moment. Now, of course, multilateral action is needed for climate change. It's not something we can ignore. But I think that the fact that it's difficult at the moment perhaps places a little bit more of the emphasis on national and regional initiatives to respond to climate change. In Southern Africa, for example, I think more of the emphasis will and should focus on adaptation. The region has not historically been responsible for large amounts of greenhouse gas emissions and continues today not to be a particularly large emitter, apart from certain countries, which shall remain nameless. So adaptation is likely to be the focus. Nevertheless, there is a role for mitigation, especially in South Africa, and as I've said, in some of the dirtier industries in the region, and also in land use policy and forest management, which we're seeing as a more relevant issue for mitigation within the region. But in adaptation, especially important, again, I emphasize, is agriculture and the need to adapt agricultural techniques, perhaps switch crops to respond to what changes arise through climate change. But also, and this is a point I'd like to emphasize very strongly, I think that there's significant potential for regional integration initiatives that we are having on the continent to facilitate some regional-based responses to climate change. And I'll give you some examples of where I think progress can be made in this regard. We've heard in the region many calls for more information about climate change. What are the effects likely to be? There's a lot of ignorance as to what is actually going to happen. This is something that can be tackled through regional publication of information, regional bodies which facilitate and disperse information to, for example, farmers. Migration, I think, is another issue that will become increasingly important. As certain regions become less able to support communities and their livelihoods, we will see more and more initially internal, but perhaps migration from one country to another. And I think this is going to be an issue that needs to be tackled at a regional level. Food security. One issue that often comes up in discussions on food security in Africa is how many of the countries in the region adopt policies, political policies, that in times when agricultural production is decimated by droughts, for example, they'll adopt policies that actually stem flows of trade, which may help, which would perhaps have helped somehow to alleviate the problems of food shortages. So the removal of non-tariff barriers on staple crops, for example, is one area in which regional integration can help with some of the effects of climate change. Water management, of course, many of the water sources in the region are shared by countries, with lakes, rivers. This is definitely an issue that needs to be tackled through cooperation between different countries. The development of renewable energy, most notably hydropower, for example, not necessarily requiring regional integration and cooperation between countries, but I think finance, expertise, and capacity can be shared in this regard and may prove useful. Economic diversification. We see in the current regional initiative in our region, the proposed free trade agreement between the EAC, COMESA, and SADC. There's an emphasis on industrial development. Now this is important for two reasons. Industrial development not only would help reduce the region's reliance on agriculture, which I've already said is one of the big vulnerabilities of the region, but it may also provide opportunities looking forward towards green industries, for example. And it's certainly something that can be assessed within the regional framework. Disaster management, investment in infrastructure, trade in environmental goods and services, these are all things which can be tackled and I think should be tackled within a regional framework. Finally, I just want to discuss quickly some challenges and opportunities that I think that should be noted here. Now, these challenges in particular relate to the designing of appropriate responses. And I think there are three main ones in the region: capacity, finance, and technology. Now, capacity is something you hear about a lot in the region, the lack of capacity to do many things. What does it involve? Well, there's a lack of information, as I've already highlighted. There's a lack of skills, lack of expertise. There's a lack of institutions that are able to absorb finance and technology that are required for adaptation efforts. There is also, within the region, a lack of good governance, which will become more and more important, I think, in dealing with climate change. In terms of finance, we've seen how the clean development mechanism has not been particularly successful. It hasn't had significant uptake in the region for various reasons, lack of capacity being one important one. And I think it's important that going forward, if a replacement scheme is operationalized for the CDM, that it takes note of its failings in Africa and perhaps is designed in such a way, perhaps through sectoral or programmatic support, which can be more accessible for African countries. Aid for trade also could maybe be leveraged to deal with some of the climate change issues, perhaps in building productive capacity, for example. And then, of course, technology. Technology is important in both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And, of course, transfer of technology, seeing as this region is not one that produces a lot of the technology itself, is increasingly important. And there are a whole range of issues there relating to intellectual property rights that I won't get into, but I think are very important. Finally, what are the opportunities? Well, there are a few. Climate change provides an opportunity for branching into new industries, for green industries, environmental goods, for example. How likely is Africa to get involved in this? It's unclear as yet, but the possibility is there and should be encouraged. New financing for development. Again, this relates to aid for trade, perhaps, as being one mechanism, a replacement CDM scheme as another. Climate change could also be a spur for regional integration. It's been suggested that perhaps South Africa, for example, may seek to move some of its dirtier industries into other countries in the region so as to spread the emissions around a bit. Whether this will actually happen, I'm not sure. But there are a number of ways in which tackling certain issues within the climate change trade nexus within the region may lead to cooperation that spills over into other areas. So in fact, this could provide a spur for regional integration. Finally, renewable energy. Again, there are a number of ways in which regional approaches may serve to provide the region with renewable energy. We, in this region, lack energy capacity. There's a significant gap for many of the countries in the region, and perhaps given the current climate change issues, this provides a good opportunity to move into renewable energy sources and to cut our reliance on coal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. Without further ado, we'll move now to Philomene, who will be doing her presentation on trade and environmental goods in the region. Thank you, Philomene.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So this morning I'm going to have a look at trade patterns, tariffs and non-tariff barriers regarding trade and environmental goods in Southern and Eastern Africa. So these are just some of the issues that I'll be focusing on. First, looking at the problem of dual-use goods, then also looking at trade patterns in Southern and Eastern Africa according to different products and different product lists, and then lastly, the tariffs and the non-tariff barrier issue. So my colleague has already highlighted that climate change is not just an environmental problem, but also a development issue for the developing countries, which are mostly affected by the impact of climate change. African countries are some of the countries which are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, mostly due to the fact that, that the economies are highly reliant on agriculture as a source of exports, growth, and the development. It is estimated that by 2020, between 75 and 250 million people in Africa would be exposed to increased water stress, and that yields from rain-fed agriculture can actually decrease by up to 50%. And this poses a very big challenge and threat to food security in the region. So international trade can actually play a very pivotal role here to source investments into green economies in the region, but also as an important driver for technological innovation and the diffusion of climate-friendly technologies. However, there are various barriers which can actually hinder trade in environmental goods. And these include the tariff, the non-tariff barriers, lack of poor, weak environmental regulations, as well as subsidies given to fossil fuels and more traditional sources of energy. Currently, there's also no clear universal definition on what is meant by environmental goods. The OECD, as you can see, I've given a definition there that's been given by the OECD, but that definition is very broad. It includes a whole range of activities and a whole range of products, so there is no specific definition for what is meant by environmental goods. This has resulted in a range of WTO member countries and member country groups to submit proposals to the WTO as what they interpret environmental goods to actually mean. The Friends of Environmental Goods and Services group, In 2007, they proposed a list of about 153 products considered by them to be environmental goods. And from this list, then the World Bank actually drew up a list of about 43 products which they see as being environmental goods. However, both these lists have been criticized that they are not single-use goods, but that we've seen already that they do not play a very big role, a very big part in trade in terms of world trade, but tariffs isn't that high. So it might be that your non-tariff barriers can actually play a vital role to contribute to trade liberalization. So in conclusion, like I said, there are still various issues surrounding the case of trade liberalization in environmental goods, your tariffs, your non-tariff barriers, the fact that there is a constant evolvement of technology, what can be possible trade implications for developing countries when, in terms of environmental goods and services. And there also seems to have been a significant growth in trade in environmental goods, in terms of world trade and also in terms of trade in countries in the region. However, as a percentage of world trade, countries in the region are still only having a very insignificant share. And seeing that tariffs are only low to moderate, so tariffs don't seem to play such a significant role in hindering trade in environmental goods at the moment, it is the non-tariff barriers which might then actually be the key to trying, if you can try and remove or just eliminate some of the non-tariff barriers, then the countries in the region might starting to play a bigger role in trade in environmental goods. The World Bank has estimated that if tariffs and non-tariff barriers on environmental goods are completely eliminated, it can actually lead to an increase of 13.5% of trade in various environmental goods compared to current levels. If we can just eliminate tariffs on environmental goods, that can lead to a 7% increase on its own. So it definitely shows that just by looking at the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers and trying to eliminate or just reduce some of them, it can contribute greatly to trade, growth and development in countries in the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wilhelmine. We now have Paul Kruger, who will be talking about regional energy trade. Thanks, Paul.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here in Durban because our industrial civilization is at the crossroads. We are in a fork in the road between an old regime based on fossil fuels and the promise of a new and clean renewable energy regime. It's an easy choice to make, but a hard one to follow. From where we are standing, we can clearly see the end of the fossil fuel society, built and dependent on fossil fuels. In July 2008, the world oil price hit a high of $147 per barrel, and all the other prices in the supply chain shot through the roof. That's because our society is still built and dependent on fossil fuels, from the petrol in our cars. Petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides are used to grow our foods. Most of our pharmaceutical products is petrochemical based. Most of our construction products are still fossil fuel based, from our plastics to our cements, our synthetics fibers, our transport, our energy, our light, everything is really still based on fossil fuel. So in 2007, when the oil price hit $80 per barrel, all the other prices in the supply chain started going up. At $120 a barrel, there were food riots in more than 20 countries because 40% of the world population is living on less than $2 a day. With the prices of certain agricultural products doubling and tripling, a record 1 billion people, almost a seventh of the world population at that time, were facing hunger and starvation. The economist at the Foundation on Economic Trend Then all hit $147 per barrel, and people stopped buying because it simply became too expensive. And the whole economic engine of the fossil fuel economy shut down in July 2007. Now, some economists believe that this was the economic earthquake of the fossil fuel regime, and that the financial collapse 60 days later was simply the aftershock. We have reached peak globalization. The end of a fossil fuel society is in sight. We now know the outer limits of how far we can globalize a world based on fossil fuels, and it's about $150 per barrel. We are entering the apocalypse now. And the economists believe that if we are growing at the same rate than we did before July 2008, we'll hit the same conundrum. We'll replenish inventories, prices of oil will go up, everything else will go up, and then it will shut down. This is what's happening right now. In 2009, oil was hovering around $40 per barrel because there was no economic activity. As soon as we try to start the engine up again, crude oil will go over $100 a barrel, purchasing power went down, and now we're heading for the second collapse. This is going to happen in cycles. When we try to start the engine, it will collapse. It is difficult to imagine how we can keep a fossil fuel economy moving if prices rise above $150 per barrel. So while these fossil fuels, the coal, the oils, the natural gas, will continue to provide a substantial portion of our energy needs well into the 21st century, we've reached a growing consensus that we're entering a twilight zone where the cost of our fossil fuel addiction is beginning to weigh down on the global economy. The International Energy Agency projects that energy demand and prices will continue to rise, and that by 2030 we will be using 60% more energy than we are doing today. Although the production and consumption of renewable energies are still small in comparison with the other forms of energy, these technologies, the adaptation of these technologies are on the rise. As from 2010, about 16% of the global energy consumption comes from renewables, 10% comes from traditional biomass, 3.4% comes from hydroelectricity, while the new renewables, small hydro, modern biomass, wind, solar, geothermal and biofuels accounts for the other 2.8%. But these are growing rapidly. The technologies being currently developed are astonishing. We've got water-cooled solar panels, we've got printable solar panels being developed, paintable solar panels are being developed. Japan is even developing a solar-based space station where they will beam solar energy back to the Earth. Stable hydrogen storage, where all types of energy will be stored in special types of sand and water, are under development. And Germany is pioneering a peer-to-peer energy internet where we'll be able to share energy amongst each other. It may sound like science fiction, but we are beginning to conceptualize where we are heading and what the possibilities are with regards to renewable energies. Africa is well suited to the production of modern renewables such as hydropower and especially of modern biomass. For example, the energy requirements of Zambia's sugar are generated primarily from renewable resources that are made from the gas, the fibrous residue remaining after the juice extraction process of the sugar, and they use that to generate electricity to power their factory and other operations. Of course, this process greatly reduces their carbon footprint. Illovo Sugar, which is the holding company of Zambia Sugar, plans to be self-sufficient within the next 3 to 5 years in terms of energy generation. They've already established a plant in Swaziland, which has started to distribute their surplus energy to the national grid in Swaziland, and to date the yearly volumes are more than the contractual purchase agreement with the Swazi government. This kind of operation is likely to become a blueprint for sugarcane development in Africa, but hopefully this will also become a blueprint for other companies in other industries. The current fossil fuel regime is characterized by a top-down centralized form of supply where one supplier, usually the state-owned energy supplier or utility, is supplying the energy. However, the centralized top-down approach is so last century, and the new renewable energy regime will be radically different. And today we can already see characteristics of where this is going. It's likely that the new regime will be collaborative and distributive, a more lateral side-by-side power, if you will, rather than the traditional top-down approach that we see in the fossil fuel regimes. We can start to imagine a future where factories like Ilovo and later commercial buildings and maybe even homes will be able to generate their own energy and feed their surplus energy into an energy or a national grid. Think of it as the same way as the personal computer in the revolution of the personal computer. In the early 70s, only a few mainframe computers existed in the world, controlled by a few companies or institutions. When Bill Gates started Microsoft, he had a vision of putting a PC on every desk in every home. So too will every factory and every building one day, and every home probably also become a micro power plant that connects to an energy internet that will be able to upload and download energy. But in the current regulatory environment, these independent producers of power will struggle to directly distribute and share the energy because it's still an industry run by state monopolies and governed by strict territorial application. The combined energy generation capacity of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa is 68 gigawatts, no more than that of Spain. Excluding South Africa, the total falls to about 28 gigawatts, roughly equivalent to the installed capacity of Argentina. What is more is that as much as 25% of the installed capacity is not operational due to various reasons, including a lack of maintenance and aging plants. Energy supply in Africa is notoriously unreliable. The uneven distribution of resources in the region has also forced many countries to adapt technically inefficient forms of power generation to serve their small domestic markets. Few countries in the region have sufficient demand to justify plants large enough to create economies of scale. So simply based on the economic geography of the energy sector in sub-Saharan Africa, regional power trade presents many potential benefits. Moreover, regional trade also offers significant clean generation capacities and growth opportunities, particularly in the area of hydropower. To promote this mutually beneficial cross-border trade of energy, 4 power pools have been established in sub-Saharan Africa. The theory behind the establishment of these pools was that enlarging the market for energy beyond the national grid would stimulate capacity investment in countries that have a comparative advantage in generating energy. But despite high hopes for the energy pools, power trade among these countries remain limited. Most of the trade occurs within the Southern African power pool, largely back and forth between South Africa and Mozambique, while South Africa also exports small amount of energy to Namibia, Botswana, and Swaziland. Although the development of the regional power pools holds great potential to influence the security of energy supply in sub-Saharan Africa, the current deficit in spare generation capacity and the national transmission and distribution infrastructure severely limits the possibilities of regional trade. So basically, we're not generating enough power in the region, and we're not distributing it effectively enough. So before the true advantages of a power pool system can be realized, infrastructure development needs to occur, not only between the interconnection lines between the countries, but also at a national level. Sub-Saharan Africa's deficit in generation capacity and lack of financial resources and investment resources has opened the door for independent producers of powers or IPPs. Energy sector reforms usually follows the prescription of industry unbundling, corporatization and commercialization, privatization, and eventual introduction of competition. But energy markets that meet these criteria are nowhere to be found in Africa. Instead, the region has seen an emergence of hybrid markets in which the incumbent state operators retains a dominant market position, while the IPPs are introduced on the fringes of the energy sector. Private sector cooperation and participation is either temporary in terms of limited time management or emergency contracts, or marginal in terms of which the independent power producers contracts with the state in terms of a power purchase agreement. In most cases, the national utility is the mandated buyer of power while still maintaining its own power generation plants. Now, many sub-Saharan African countries are using the single buyer model with the national utility as the only mandated buyer of energy. But it's not always clear whether this implies that they're also the exclusive buyer and if they have exclusive purchasing rights. For example, are these independent power producers required to sell only to the national utility, or are they allowed to contract separately with large customers or trade across borders? To prepare the regulatory environment for this distributive and collaborative side-by-side power of the coming energy revolution, the goal should be to liberalize these markets for these independent power producers so that they would allow to seek their own customers. Although the national utility can play an important role in aggregating the demand and entering into long-term contracts, few advantages can be found in assigning it exclusive buying rights. Instead, these IPPs should be allowed to enter into willing buyer, willing seller arrangements to directly supply to both the national utility and also to large customers. So if countries want to draw private investors into the energy sector, they need to put an enabling environment in place. South Africa is in the process of trying to create such an environment to provide for the more meaningful participation of these independent producers of power. The Integrated Resource Plan for Electricity of 2010 formulates the need to increase capacity and change the nation's energy mix and comparative landscape in response to the climate change and other globalization issues. As reflected in the Integrated Resource Plan of 2010, the power supply crisis and the concerns around climate change has accelerated the need for Eskom to diversify their energy sources towards more diverse energy sources, some of which be produced by these independent power producers. So the plan is to produce at least 30% of the power from independent power producers by 2030. To make this possible, an independent system and market operator, an ISMO, was proposed, a separate entity from Eskom which would act as a buyer of all electricity in South Africa. Such a model is intended to remove a conflict of interest between the buyer and the seller of energy in South Africa. A draft bill was published in May this year to establish this ISMO. The bill stipulates that the ISMO will at first be a ring-fenced entity within Eskom, and the plan is to separate it gradually. There are still a number of outstanding issues that's not been resolved and which is the subject of a passionate debate in South Africa. There are still issues such as who will be the owner of the transmission grid, who will have access to the grid. There are issues around the pricing of electricity, and there are issues on the capacity of the independent power producers, to name a few. But this debate and the issues around it just illustrates the complexities around restructuring a hybrid market of this kind. But nevertheless, the debate on the restructuring of the energy market is heating up. South Africa has also put out a tender to invite bids for 3,725 megawatts of renewable energy to be provided in South Africa. Although the tender requirements require a joint venture of 40% with a 25% BE component, 270 private companies indicated their interest, and at the end, 53 final bids were received. Now, this clearly shows the appetite of private investors for the energy market in Africa, and also the viability of renewable energy strategy driven by the private sector. Eskom has also indicated plans to expand the national grid beyond South Africa's borders and to improve the interconnection rates, the interconnection lines, and have prioritized a number of regional strategies to increase energy transmission in the region. And because South Africa is the largest consumer and producer by far of electricity in Africa, what happens in South Africa will ultimately have a regional impact. So this will enable us to possibly export energy to the rest of the region, but also to import clean energy in the form of hydropower from some of the countries in the region. At the moment, energy liberalization has also taken priority, and SADC in COMESA and the EAC. In SADC and COMESA, it has been prioritized as one of the sectors in terms of services negotiations, which will be liberalized, and also the EAC is set to start negotiating the energy sector early next year. Also, in terms of the tripartite FTA, which comprise all three of these regional configurations, there are plans to address energy infrastructure, there are plans to create a regional energy market, and there are also plans to liberalize the energy market. So if regional energy trade are allowed to expand, the rising demand would provide incentives for several countries to develop their energy potential, which for many of the African countries would mean development of their significant hydro energy potential, something which would give Africa the edge in the generation and production and distribution of these clean, renewable energies. I'm just going to conclude by a quote from Thomas Edison. We will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. And I'm sure someday the same will be true for renewable energy as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. These are our three presentations, and we now have an opportunity to have your questions and contributions. And I'd like to open the floor and take a first round of questions or comments. Recognize one hand right at the front here.
Thank you. I'm Tom Gruen, Emeritus Faculty at Georgetown in Washington, D.C., currently a Schuller Foundation Fellow in Germany. My question concerns the relationship between regional arrangements and the multilateral system. It's not a central concern, I guess, in any of your presentations, but I think it's a legitimate issue. And I wonder whether any of you or anyone you know has given any thought to creating a notification process whereby regional arrangements, whether they're trade or climate or both, a notification process in which the FCCC would find out about what the regional arrangements are and how they will contribute to climate change mitigation. And I'm asking that because, as you all know, there is a WTO arrangement for notification in which, at least in principle, such arrangements have to meet certain criteria. I'm sorry, that's a little longer than I planned.
Thank you very much. We do have, from the horse's mouth, Harsha Singh is here, so we'll certainly have a response from him as well. Any other questions at this stage? Since I don't see any hands right now, actually, sorry, over there. Thank you.
Mahesh Suvatan from ICTSD. My question was to speak for environmental concern. Sorry for confusing. You mentioned that the tariff rates on CFLs, and they are particularly high in South Africa. Can you tell me what the reason for that is, and especially because is South Africa a domestic producer of CFL lights? And given that South Africa is so coal-dependent and you need to scale up energy efficiency, I would presume it makes sense for South Africa to import at zero duty the CFLs because that will contribute. But why isn't that the case? Is it because of domestic industry being here or some other concerns? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do see another hand now. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gal Sadulski. I'm engaged in ISO with the carbon footprint standard that's why I'm here mainly. It's perhaps less a question than a comment. I noted the impact of non-tariff barriers on the trade, and it's interesting to note the impact it might have on trade according to the World Bank assessment. However, what I missed a little bit in this presentation is, so to say, what are the other positive impacts? Why those non-tariff barriers have been established? Did you also assess, so to say, the upside of the impacts of those, and whether there is room, so to say, for optimization? That's for me the key point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? Then perhaps I can ask Harsha Singh to perhaps give us his perspective on that first question, that interface between regional agreements and the multilateral system in terms of notification.
Thank you. First of all, I want to appreciate very good presentations, and I really think all of you have approached the issue with deep thought, so thank you very much. I'll address the first question, though it was not for WTO, it was for UNFCCC, if my understanding is correct. In fact, in the question, the speaker highlighted that there is a system in the WTO which actually receives notifications from regional trade agreements. And then we have a mechanism to monitor this, discuss it, and there is not just a mechanism within the regional trade agreement context per se, in a limited sense, because we have different committees looking at different things. But even the Director General's trade policy monitoring report, it provides greater detail. Our trade policy review mechanisms with individual country-specific reports also provide details. And we also have an initiative to put all this in electronic form. So, because transparency is one of the cornerstones of the WTO agreement, this becomes very important. And my understanding is it not desirable to develop the same kind of system in the context of UNFCCC? I think in a world where we need to build trust, in a world where we need to be clear about the directions which are being taken, including, as we have seen in the lectures today, such a system of transparency and reporting is essential. So it should be put in place. Or if another organization already has such aspects, because the questioner tried to emphasize a specific part of the notifications in the context of climate change per se. So you can pick on those and have your members work in a more focused way to provide that transparency. I think it's a very good idea. I would like to comment on the last question also, because the speaker talked about a balance. Actually, that is the kind of balance which we have, our members have tried to achieve in the agreements at WTO. Specifically, what you talked about is reflected in the agreement on technical barriers to trade and agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, etc. Because there are specific objectives which the non-tariff measures, and people distinguish between measures and barriers. And there's a big debate internationally on where to draw the line. But there are justified reasons for putting these in place. And the balance has to be that when these standards or these regulations are put in place, they should not be given scope to be used in an arbitrary, discriminatory, or with protectionist intent. So, to the extent some required objective justifies a standard, and in fact, your discussion itself shows that there is a need for such kind of standards. If I start from the first one itself, so to the extent there is a need, there is justification, and a process of discipline needs to be maintained, that it is not used in an arbitrary way, in a way which actually is protectionist rather than aiming at the right kind of objective. That's why then the next question is, okay, what is the standard? That's why people emphasize international standards. So all these are built into our agreement also. I advise you to go to our website and look at the details. It's a very user-friendly website, and I'm sure if you need any further information, we'll be happy to provide.
Thank you very much for that, Harsh. I'll turn now to our panelists for their responses.
If I can then also just firstly respond on the question in terms of the non-tariff barriers. Also wanted to say that mostly there's a difference between the non-tariff measures and the non-tariff measures as non-tariff barriers. The fact that these various measures which can be implemented as a barrier to trade, as a measure, for instance, the sanitary and the phytosanitary measures, that isn't always, it's not necessarily a barrier to trade. It only becomes a barrier once additional costs, for instance, are levied on the trading partners when they actually have to fulfill these opportunities. So non-tariff barriers in itself is actually quite subjective, because what's a barrier to trade for one country isn't necessarily a barrier for trade for producers and exporters or importers in another country. So that is actually quite subjective. It differs from country to country. Then as well, in terms of non-tariff barriers, it's quite actually difficult to measure them. It's how you measure a non-tariff barrier, how you place a value on a non-tariff barrier. That's also always up for discussion, which specific method do you actually use to see that if a producer of a product has to comply to specific phytosanitary and sanitary measures, and you've got your export and your transport and all of that stuff, how do you actually measure it in terms of what is the true barrier, the true cost to trade of that specific product? So that's also the other problem, is the fact that it's also that it's not always very easy to measure. And then, of course, like I said, because sometimes a barrier or a non-tariff measure is not a barrier for all, is if you, for instance, have an incentive to produce some sort of renewable energy resource, then that can actually be a benefit to a specific country. But like, for instance, if they have a subsidy that is given to fossil fuels, then that can actually be a barrier to developing renewable energy sources in a specific country. So it does differ from country to country. So we haven't done actually a complete evaluation to see to what extent maybe, for instance, subsidies or incentives have contributed to the production or the development of environmental friendly technologies. But I'm quite sure, because it differs from country to country, a subsidy given in a renewable energy source in a specific country won't necessarily be a barrier. There can be some positive spin-offs from those as well. Then in terms of the tariffs on the compact fluorescent lamps, like you saw in the table, actually all the emerging countries and all the countries in southern and eastern Africa, except Libya, which actually imports a duty-free, most of the countries actually have quite a moderate to high tariff on CFLs. And it seems that that's mostly to protect the domestic industry, to actually because CFLs is a relatively easy way to actually move towards more renewable energy sources. It seems that a lot of countries, especially your developing countries and countries in southern and eastern Africa, is actually trying to get their own domestic industries actually moving on producing those products. So it seems that, for instance, the solar water heaters, where they actually reduce tariffs in order to reach their renewable energy targets while they're actually building capacity. What happened in CFLs, it seems that actually the opposite happened, that they actually kept their tariffs relatively moderate to high in order to produce their own domestic industries.
Thank you very much. Any comments from our other two panelists?
Yeah, just on the question about the notifications. Sorry, I can't give you a very satisfactory answer. I'm not aware of any formalized mechanisms as such. It certainly sounds like an excellent idea. Perhaps if just a couple of issues to consider. I mean, one, certainly in our region, I think the climate response issue area is probably not as far evolved as the trade area. Secondly, there will be differences in certain regions in terms of we would be likely to be notifying a lot of adaptation initiatives. Maybe some other regions will be more on the mitigation side. Then also because, of course, we're talking about trade and climate change, there's also the point that there exists some, thinking, for example, of the global trade alert. Within the trade area, mechanisms for notifying. We have a regional, I think within SADC, for notifying non-tariff barriers. It's a website, and people can submit to non-tariff barriers. So where trade and climate change response mechanisms meet, there may be scope for, or there may be an issue involved in which mechanism do you notify. This is an issue that deals with the climate change issue, but it's also potentially a trade barrier. So there are a few issues to think about. But I think it's a good point.
Thank you very much. We do have some time for another round of questions, if there are any further comments or questions. If not, then it may be tea time. And it remains for me just to thank you very much for your participation and to acknowledge our presenters here. This work on trade and climate change in Tralec is fairly new. It is an area that we recognize as particularly important given the region that we work in. And we work in East and Southern Africa, whereas our presenters have indicated there are particular challenges that we will face in terms of the development of this nexus, in terms of policy, interventions, and support for the development of cleaner technologies and a green economy. So thank you very much, and we do hope you enjoy a cup of tea. I would like just to thank our organizers, the WTO, the ICTSD, and the Department of Trade and Industry in South Africa, and of course our partners, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, for their support. So thank you very much, and we'll see you later during the day. Thank you.